As Al-Hallaj stood before his executioners in 922 AD, facing death for his mystical teachings, the crowd expected him to speak, to defend himself, to cry out. Instead, he chose silence. But this wasn't the silence of defeat or fear. According to those who witnessed it, this silence carried more power than any words he had ever spoken. It was a silence so profound, so full of meaning, that it shook the foundations of everyone present. What did Al-Hallaj understand about silence that we've forgotten? And why did he choose it as his final teaching? To understand the power of Al-Hallaj's final silence, we need to go back to the beginning of his spiritual journey. Born around 858 AD in what is now Iran, Al-Hallaj lived during the golden age of Islamic mysticism. This was a time when Sufi masters were exploring the deepest mysteries of spiritual experience, pushing the boundaries of what could be known about divine reality. From his earliest years, Al-Hallaj showed signs of extraordinary spiritual sensitivity. He wasn't content with conventional religious practice. He wanted direct experience of the divine, unmediated by books, teachers, or traditional interpretations. This hunger for immediate spiritual knowledge would eventually lead him to insights that would both inspire and terrify his contemporaries. As a young man, Al-Hallaj studied with some of the greatest Sufi masters of his time, but he quickly discovered that the deepest spiritual truths couldn't be learned from others. They had to be experienced directly through intense spiritual practice and divine grace. He embarked on years of meditation, prayer, and mystical contemplation that gradually transformed his understanding of reality itself. During this period, Al-Hallaj began to experience states of consciousness that were difficult to describe in ordinary language. He felt his individual identity dissolving into something much larger and more fundamental. The boundaries between self and divine, between human and ultimate reality, began to blur in ways that challenged everything he had been taught about the nature of existence. It was during one of these profound mystical experiences that Al-Hallaj spoke the words that would eventually lead to his execution. In a state of spiritual ecstasy, he declared, "I am the truth." To many who heard this, it sounded like blasphemy. How could a human being claim to be divine truth itself? But Al-Hallaj wasn't speaking from ego or arrogance. He was expressing a mystical realization that transcended ordinary concepts of individual identity. What Al-Hallaj had discovered is what mystics throughout history have experienced. In the deepest states of spiritual realization, the sense of separate selfhood disappears. What remains is pure consciousness, unlimited awareness, the very essence of what religious traditions call divine reality. From this perspective, there is no separation between the experiencer and the ultimate truth being experienced. But Al-Hallaj's declaration created enormous controversy. Religious authorities saw it as dangerous heresy that threatened the fundamental structure of Islamic theology. Political leaders viewed it as a challenge to established order. Even some fellow Sufis criticized him for speaking so openly about mystical experiences that were traditionally kept secret. For years, Al-Hallaj faced persecution, imprisonment, and exile. But rather than retreating from his teachings, he continued to speak about the profound spiritual truths he had experienced. He wrote poetry describing the divine love that consumed his heart. He taught students about the path to mystical union. He refused to compromise his understanding of spiritual reality, even when it put his life in danger. However, as the persecution intensified and his situation became more desperate, something remarkable began to happen. Al-Hallaj started to discover that silence could communicate spiritual truths even more powerfully than words. He noticed that when he sat quietly with students, without speaking at all, they often had deeper spiritual insights than when he gave elaborate explanations. This discovery led Al-Hallaj to explore what he called the eloquence of silence. He began to understand that words, no matter how carefully chosen, always fall short of expressing ultimate spiritual reality. Language by its very nature divides and separates. It creates categories, distinctions, and concepts that fragment the unity of mystical experience. Silence, on the other hand, doesn't divide or separate. It doesn't create artificial boundaries between self and other, human and divine, knower and known. In genuine silence, these dualistic concepts simply dissolve. What emerges is a direct transmission of spiritual presence that bypasses the limitations of conceptual thinking entirely. Al-Hallaj discovered that this kind of silence wasn't empty or passive. It was intensely alive, pregnant with meaning, vibrating with spiritual energy. When someone had achieved the necessary level of spiritual development, they could receive profound teachings through silence alone. The teacher's presence itself became the teaching, communicating truths that words could never adequately express. This understanding completely transformed Al-Hallaj's approach to spiritual guidance. While he continued to write and speak when necessary, he began to rely more and more on silent transmission. Students would sit with him for hours without a word being spoken, yet they would leave with their understanding fundamentally transformed. Modern neuroscience is beginning to understand something that mystics like Al-Hallaj knew centuries ago. Research shows that silent meditation synchronizes brain waves between teacher and student in ways that verbal communication cannot achieve. When two people sit in deep silence together, their nervous systems actually begin to entrain with each other, creating a state of shared consciousness that facilitates profound learning and healing. But Al-Hallaj understood that this phenomenon wasn't just psychological. He believed that in genuine spiritual silence, individual consciousness opens to what he called the universal heart. This is a state where personal awareness becomes transparent to divine awareness itself. In this condition, spiritual insights can be transmitted directly from consciousness to consciousness without the mediation of words or concepts. As Al-Hallaj's reputation grew and persecution intensified, he faced an increasingly difficult choice. He could continue speaking publicly about his mystical experiences, knowing that it would likely lead to his death. Or he could retreat into silence, protecting himself but potentially abandoning those who needed his guidance. The choice was complicated by Al-Hallaj's understanding of spiritual responsibility. He believed that mystical knowledge wasn't meant to be hoarded by individuals, but shared for the benefit of all humanity. Yet he also recognized that speaking openly about certain spiritual truths could be misunderstood and cause more harm than good. This dilemma led Al-Hallaj to perhaps his most profound insight about the nature of spiritual teaching. He realized that the highest form of communication isn't speaking or remaining silent, but knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. True spiritual wisdom lies in understanding which truths can be expressed in words, and which can only be transmitted through presence itself. During his final imprisonment, Al-Hallaj had years to contemplate this understanding. He used this time not to plan his defense or prepare elaborate theological arguments, but to deepen his exploration of sacred silence. He discovered that even in the most difficult circumstances, silence could be a source of profound spiritual strength and clarity. When Al-Hallaj was finally brought before his executioners, he had reached a level of spiritual realization where words seemed almost irrelevant. He had discovered something more powerful than any argument or explanation, the ability to transmit spiritual truth through pure presence. This is why he chose silence in his final moments. According to historical accounts, Al-Hallaj's silence during his execution wasn't the silence of someone who had given up hope or accepted defeat. It was the silence of someone who had found a form of communication more profound than speech. Witnesses described feeling overwhelmed by the spiritual power that radiated from his presence. even as his physical body was being destroyed. This final silence became Al-Hallaj's ultimate teaching. It demonstrated that spiritual truth isn't dependent on words, arguments, or even physical survival. The deepest realities of mystical experience can be transmitted through the quality of presence itself, through the consciousness that shines through a person who has achieved genuine, spiritual realization, not Al-Hallaj's understanding of sacred. Silence offers profound insights for anyone seeking deeper spiritual development. In our world of constant noise and endless chatter, we have largely forgotten the power of genuine quietude. We think that communication means speaking, that learning means acquiring information, that teaching means explaining concepts. But Al-Hallaj discovered that the most important spiritual transmissions happen in the spaces between words, in the pregnant pauses where truth can emerge without the distortion of conceptual thinking. He learned that silence isn't the absence of communication, but the presence of a deeper form of communication that operates beyond the level of ordinary mind. This doesn't mean that words are unimportant or that we should stop speaking altogether. Al-Hallaj himself was an eloquent writer and powerful speaker when the situation called for it. But he understood that words are tools, and like any tools, they have appropriate and inappropriate uses. Some truths can be spoken. Others can only be lived, embodied, and transmitted through the quality of one's presence. For those seeking to develop their own spiritual understanding, Al-Hallaj's teaching about sacred silence offers practical guidance. He discovered that regular periods of deep silence, especially in the company of others who share the same intention, can open doorways to spiritual insight that no amount of reading or discussion can provide. But this silence isn't just sitting quietly. It's a conscious choice to let go of the constant mental commentary that usually fills our awareness. It's an opening to whatever wants to emerge when the mind stops its habitual activity. It's a form of listening so deep that it can hear the subtlest whispers of divine guidance. Al-Hallaj also understood that this kind of silence requires great courage. When we stop talking, we stop hiding behind words. We become vulnerable to whatever truths want to emerge. We can no longer distract ourselves with clever explanations or comfortable concepts. We have to face reality directly without the buffer of mental activity. This is why Al-Hallaj's final silence was so powerful. It demonstrated a level of spiritual courage that went beyond physical bravery. He was willing to let go of all defensive strategies, all attempts to control how others perceived him, all efforts to justify his spiritual experiences. He trusted that truth itself would speak through his presence more eloquently than any words. He could offer. The legacy of Al-Hallaj's final teaching continues to influence spiritual seekers today. His example reminds us that the deepest spiritual communications often happen without words. They occur in moments of genuine presence, in spaces of shared silence, in the quality of attention we bring to each moment of our lives. In a world where we're constantly bombarded with information, opinions, and explanations, Al-Hallaj's teaching about sacred silence offers a different path. It suggests that wisdom isn't something we acquire through accumulating more knowledge, but something we discover by learning to be fully present to what is already here. As Al-Hallaj demonstrated in his final moments, silence that emerges from deep spiritual realization doesn't separate us from others. It connects us to the source of truth that lives within everyone. When we learn to communicate from this place of silent presence, our words carry more power and our silence speaks louder than any speech we could devise.